Jessie, the Select Committee has recently reported views on the BBC. You can see tonight, here we are, we're talking about whether actually at some point the BBC and us would be better served if it was under statutory regulation rather than a charter. That's one of the many issues. There are issues around the integrity of the BBC's funding settlement. Would you like to talk to us about the role you see for the Select Committee in this rather changing landscape?
Well, thank you very much indeed, Colette, and thank you all, ladies and gentlemen, and other panellists. I must say, it's a bit daunting to follow Melvyn Bragg after such a tour de force, not least for a man who's been devoutly consuming In Our Time for the last 35 years, as I have. So it's rather magnificent. I'm afraid Melvyn may be slightly unsettled by the degree to which I agree with him on many of the things he's said. I mean, my view of the BBC is expressed in the opening sentences of our report. I think it's a magnificent institution. And I'm writing a book on Adam Smith at the moment, and Smith is par excellence with Hume, the engine of the Scottish Enlightenment, and as you know, what they believe in above all is an educated public realm. This is a Presbyterian idea, very egalitarian idea, and I think the BBC is an absolutely vital contributor to that educated public realm in this country through programmes such as In Our Time and internationally as well. So I think it's a magnificent institution. I think it's also fair to say that no institution is perfect in a temporal world, and the BBC is not perfect either. Rather than dwell on that, as a man who made the case of the BBC on Start the Week, very much in the terms that Melvyn did, but only invoking the hill farmer guarding his tea leaves or his tea plants in Darjeeling and listening to Test Match Special. Maybe I can just say a couple of things. I can't speak for the government, of course, but I can speak for my committee. I'll try not to get too far ahead of them. So the first question, how severe actually is the threat from government to the BBC? And we were extremely rude in the, well, not extremely rude, but pretty rude, in the Select Committee report about the way in which the July negotiations or non-negotiations had been conducted between government and the BBC management. But I do want to ask the question because Melvyn says he'd like the BBC licence fee to go up. Well, it is going up. It's going up with inflation as a result of that settlement. And although one might deplore the way in which the settlement was reached, there was no transparency to it. There was no proper public cogitation about what the settlement should be, or even, as it were, what it actually still is, since it doesn't consider issues of scope yet or efficiency particularly. Both things which should be considered in parallel and in public. Although that's not the case, it was the case that the leadership of the BBC decided that this was a deal that it could live with and work with. So how serious is the threat? Well, in many ways, what is extraordinary is that every charter renewal we get diabolical worries about threats from government, and yet, as Melvyn said, very little has changed in large chunks of the BBC. It still produces magnificent programmes, and if the threat was so awful, then maybe that would have changed a lot. One of the things that he identifies rightly has changed is the astronomical salaries in some cases that are paid for talent. I don't think that's anything that I would disagree with, or indeed the committee, and we've been quite concerned about that, both on the worldwide side and in studios and in core management. So that's I suppose the question, how severe genuinely is the threat? Second question is legislation really such a good idea? And I absolutely take the points that David makes about legislation, but let's not forget that one of the advantages of a charter arrangement is precisely that it is, in a sense, less political. Yes, it does give the executive more discretion, but it's, the culmination of the process in this case will take, fully 9 months to a year, probably a year if the white paper is delayed, as we think. And then there'll be further discussion in public forums about the details of the white paper. So while there is a degree of ministerial discretion that one might think is unattractive, it is nevertheless the case that this is not being kicked around on the floor of the House of Commons in a way that would politicise much discussion about the BBC. And so I think it has some advantages. I also think that when you put things on the floor of the House of Commons, you follow the parliamentary timetable, which means that parliamentarians then think about funding, which means they think about it possibly every 5 years, possibly earlier. The idea which we don't really have at the moment, which is the BBC licence fee is considered a tax, might then start to take root, and the result might well be instability for funding. And we've taken evidence on the committee that instability would be potentially very damaging and threatening to investment. So I'm a little sceptical about whether or not legislation is always the right way forward, although it should be said, on the other side of it, that the fact that Channel 4 is established by legislation has certainly been a disincentive to government in thinking about the potential privatisation of parts of Channel 4. So there's that certainly to be said for it. Third point is, how genuine is it that the idea that the BBC is really a government department? I don't think that's true at all. I think the BBC operationally has an enormous degree of independence at the moment. I'd like to strengthen that independence, and we've proposed ways of doing that in the committee report by strengthening the board, making it more of a unitary board, giving the Director General more support as he attempts to make change in the organisation, toughening up the accountability regulator in order to offset the increased powers of the executive, giving Ofcom a clearer remit containing the whole, so that there's essentially unitary regulator versus regulatee relationship. And I think actually that has the effect of strengthening the BBC, because it allows the leadership to have more power, but it adequately constrains that power and makes it accountable. And finally, the licence fee. Well, I was very interested to hear what Martin said. I do think he's missing out one aspect, and there are experts in this room, and much more expert in this issue than I am, but the reason why this over 75 issue is the way it is because Gordon Brown, at risk of making a political point, put in legislation that the BBC, that there would be free licence fees to the over 75s, and then there was a compensating payment, and there was a political trap there. The political trap was that whoever then wanted to stop this extremely expensive and escalating cost as over 75s became a higher percentage of licence fees would then have to put a repeal bill through the House of Commons specifically repealing free licences to the over 75s. Now that was, if I may say so, not in the interests of good government or in the interests of the BBC. And I think if we're looking at ways in which BBC's well-being has been prejudiced, that would be a rather helpful place to start. Thank you very much.